The Rishri is across it, right. Okay, where we would have the Torah, right? And why is that? Because not only is the building holy and is the sanctuary the holiest part of the building, but the ark is the holiest part of the sanctuary and the inside the ark. It's just like this Midrash. Yeah, it sort of persists in a kind of way. If it was once holy, it's still holy. This is why probably pagan places became holy sites also when we get to the monotheistic religions. There's a sense of it persisting. Okay, so it's going to be glorified. 10, in Bava Batra, it was said, whoever did not see the temple building erected by Herod, that is not the first temple, that is the second temple, right, by Herod, has not seen a truly beautiful building in his lifetime. Certainly God's house would be exceedingly beautiful. Not only is the temple the most holy, that holiness is reinforced by drawing our attention to its superlative beauty. In other words, why do we care about how the place looks? Because we make an association between holiness and beauty. Right? Now the definition of beauty can be, right, so some people would say the holiest place is the Grand Canyon. Right? That kind of natural beauty. But in a synagogue or in a church, of which Simone and I were in many this past summer because we went to Florence. And if you want to see a lot of the best art in Florence, you have to go into all the churches. Right? And Simone is a medievalist, so she was very interested in each of the churches, and they're very different from each other, with different kinds of art in them, and it's fascinating on that level, but all of them have a kind of beauty. Right? And that's important also. So there's a tie between the sense of beauty and the sense of holiness. That makes sense to everybody? Nobody has a problem with that. Okay. Let's look at 11. Another Talmud tractate. This one is called Ta'anit, which has ostensibly to do with fast days. You know that every tractate in the Talmud has a subject, but they never stay on that subject. Yeah, I do. See? I had it all ready. Do you want to pass them out? Okay, let me just keep one. So, as she's passing these out, the Talmud only officially starts with the subject of the subject, meaning, you know, if it's called Tractate Rosh Hashanah, it's going to talk about Rosh Hashanah, but certainly not only Rosh Hashanah, right? Same thing with Tractate Shabbat or whatever it is. Currently, my rabbi study group that I've been part of for years, we just started Avodah Zarah, which means idol worship. There's actually a tractate called Idol Worship. But it deals with all sorts of things beyond idol worship. That's true here too. So in Ta'anit, so we find in the days of Herod, when they were engaged in building the holy temple, the rains would fall only at night when the work was being done. The next day the wind would blow, the clouds would disperse, and the sun would come out. And the people would go out to their work knowing that the work of heavens was in their hands. Building God's abode was no ordinary project. So what is that going to mean? God is going to sort of keep an eye on the project, right? You're building my house. Anybody who's ever built a house knows that you can't just rely on the architect and the contractor. Unless you want the bathroom where the closet was supposed to be, you better be paying attention to what's going on. So God is paying attention, and God sees to it, it's only going to rain at night. It's not, nothing is going to interfere with the work. Now, why would they bother to tell us this? Isn't it obvious? Why do they want to say this to us? Okay, yes? Is that what you were going to say? I think it's trying to tell us something about holiness, that holiness has sort of God's eye on it all the time. Where does holiness come from? So this is a very big subject. What is the holy? A guy named Rudolf Otto wrote a book the beginning of the 20th century, if I'm remembering right, called The Idea of the Holy, something like that is what it's called. And he comes up with this, he creates vocabulary. And of course, if you create vocabulary, then you must be a genius. He called it the numinous. Right? Sort of, we know it when we see it, but don't ask me to to define it, right? And so the mysterium tremendum, I think, is another term that he uses in the book. It's the great mystery is the holy. But I would suggest that it's not so hard to understand if you think of it as all holiness comes from God. And so when we want to be holy, we have to be in relationship with God. The closer we are with God, the closer we are to holiness. So that's what the so-called sacrifices are all about, right? We call them sacrifices, but in Hebrew, they're not called sacrifices. In Hebrew, they're called korbanot. And what is korbanot? It's the same root as likarev, or to approach. So the korbanot would be better translated as offerings than sacrifices, which comes from the Latin. Right? So offerings, why did they offer up all these animals and the meal offering and the libation offering and all these things? It was their way of approaching holiness. What do we offer up? Prayer. And that's supposed to be our way. I'm not sure that I don't know, for a lot of people it doesn't work, obviously. But what we are supposed to be doing when we are praying, and we may talk about this more later on, is not simply asking for things. We are supposed to be approaching God. We are supposed to be getting close to holiness. Yes? Sure, that's another one. So, tzedakah. The reason I said tzedakah instead of tzedakah, I grew up with Ashkenazi pronunciation too, is tzedakah has the Yiddishization to it and is best translated as charity. Charity is also from the Latin. And it has to do, it's not exactly the same as tzedakah, which comes from tzedek, justice or righteousness. So charity, it is charity, but it's because we are obligated as human beings, because God tells us we're obligated as human beings to take care of each other. So it's not out of the goodness of our heart. So charity, right, is out of the goodness of your heart. And that's the way we operate because we live in a non-Jewish matrix. So federation is never going to refer to your contribution as fulfilling your obligation. It's going to refer to it as your gift. Right? However, Jewishly, tzedakah is not a gift. It is something that we are required to do. That's a whole different slant, right? But you're absolutely right. It's supposed to get us closer to God. You can say that, though, about all of the mitzvot. All of the mitzvot, I know that even ones, let's say, like kashrut. Believe me, I'm not turning into Nachum Mendel, all right? But what is kashrut all about? Why would we enter a food discipline? It's a discipline, exactly right. And it is supposed to remind us of certain things, the sanctity of life and the rest. And it's a kind of way of approaching holiness. You could say that about all of the things, the holidays, the disciplines. Why do you put a mezuzah on your door? All the above. But even more than that, in Jewish tradition, after the temple is destroyed and the place of holiness is gone, what substitutes for it? We may get back to this also, but what substitutes for it? What comes in? Synagogue and your home. And what is the center of your home in terms of holiness? What? The table. That's exactly right. The dining room table, which is like the altar. So you say a bracha at the altar, right? On Friday nights, what do you do with the challah? Why do you put salt on it? Because that's what they did with the sacrifices, with the korbanot. In other words, you're sort of emulating this notion of what went on in the temple in your own home, and your home becomes the mikdash ma'at, the little sanctuary that everybody has so that they can access holiness. So therefore, these passages are trying to build it all up. That's what they're trying to tell us. All right, so let's look at number 12, which I think is sort of funny, but it shows you that the rabbis actually were not just floating around on cloud nine. They were aware of things. So Mishnah Avot, now this is before the Talmud. This is in the Mishnah, which is the original code of rabbinic law that the Talmud then works from. It's in the tractate called Avot, or Fathers, or Ethics of the Fathers, we call it in English, the 5th chapter, the 5th Mishnah, 5th paragraph. Suggests the inevitable problems of smells and pests and possible ritual difficulties stemming from the actual work of the temple. Think about the temple. Was this a pleasant place where there were all these people all the time, and they're bringing animals to be sacrificed, and there's blood being sprinkled around, and not exactly, the Hilton. And so they would have asked themselves, what is this like? And they said, in the temple, there were 10 miracles performed for our ancestors. What were they? No woman ever miscarried from the odor of the sacrificial flesh. 2, the sacrificial flesh never became putrid. 3, no fly was ever seen in the slaughterhouse. That would be a miracle. No pollution ever befell the high priest on Yom Kippur. What is the pollution here? We're not talking about air pollution. What? Yes. We're talking about a nocturnal emission. That would have been very bad timing. Yeah, they kept him awake all night. I'm sure that was their goal. That was it. The rain never extinguished the fire on the woodpile on the altar. The wind never prevailed over the column of smoke. There was never found a disqualifying defect in the omer, the 2 loaves, or the showbread. In other words, everything always worked exactly the way it was supposed to work. The people stood tightly pressed together, yet prostrated themselves with ease. Think about this. They were all supposed to lay flat on the ground. But there were thousands of them in the temple, crowded together at these holidays, shoulder to shoulder. So how could they possibly have all bowed down to the ground? It's a miracle, right? Okay. Neither snake nor scorpion ever injured anyone in Jerusalem. And the last one, no man ever said to his fellow, the space is too narrow for me to lodge overnight in Jerusalem. In other words, no matter how many people came to Jerusalem on the festivals, there was enough room for everybody. This actually happens in Israel. My first trip to Israel, I may have told some of you this story before. I guess you could say in some ways I have experienced several miracles in my life, but one of them was during my first trip to Israel. In the old days, when there was only a 2-lane road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, it was before it was called Highway 1. It was just the Jerusalem road, and it went up to the Judean hills on this windy road. I was sure we were going to fall off because we were this big bus. We were right on the edge, and the bus is driving down the center of the thing to get up, and then all of a sudden I look, I'm sitting behind the driver, and I see another vehicle coming at us. I'm certain this is it. I'm 21 years old. This is it. We're going off the edge of this. But somehow, miraculously, the road widened. And we went by, and everybody was fine. I have no explanation for it other than what you just read. Okay. Questions about this, about the temple, before we move on? Well, the rabbis? No, of course not. When are the rabbis living? The Mishnah is compiled by the year 200. That was the earliest thing that we just read. Okay? And if it's the Babylonian Talmud, roughly speaking, is between 2 and 500. Some say up to 600. There's some scholarly dispute about that in Babylon. There's also what's called the Palestinian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud, which is going on in the land of Israel, but it's all several centuries after the temple is gone. Yeah, that was what my point was, is that they are not so much talking about reality, they're using reality-like terms to make a point about what this place was like and why it was important. Now, because I'm sure in their time they had plenty of people saying, woe is me, everything is lost, the temple is gone. And they brilliantly built up the temple to help people deal with that at the same time that they were developing new institutions and new ways of doing things to replace the temple. I mean, it's really a nice model for how to do a kind of change. I can imagine after the temple was destroyed, Jews running around on every hilltop lighting fires and sacrificing animals and saying, we've got to find a new way to do this. And the rabbis essentially saying, no, that's not how we're going to proceed. The temple was very beautiful. It was very holy. It was most important. We'll continue to venerate it, but we're going to meet over here for prayer. Okay, so this next thing is a story. And those of you who used to come to share Shabbat may well recognize that I used to tell this story. Probably over the years I told it at least 3 times because it's one of my favorite stories. And I would love to tell you, if you look here, you'll see there's no citation where it is. That's because I can't find it anywhere in the tradition. I can find it in lots of modern books. And in none of them does it give a citation where it's from. So it's this is clearly not from that strata like of the Talmud nearly 2,000 years ago, but it's like there are some things that are not true, but they should be. You know, there's stories, even though they're not factual, they're still true. This is that same kind of story. It doesn't really matter how ancient it is. Okay. Now, I think we're going to need, we're going to need page 5. You weren't here last week, Joel. I'm only passing the pages out one at a time so nobody reads ahead. So no one reads ahead. So the question I think this story is going to answer is, why is the temple where it was? Now think about this for a second. We talked about this last week. What is the holy mountain? Right? There's a mountain, that's the umbilical. Where is the holy mountain? We read all those passages that it's Mount Sinai. Right? Because it's in the wilderness. The wilderness doesn't belong to anyone. The tribes won't fight with each other. All of the other nations will not be able to say, well, we would have taken the Torah, except you gave it in the land of Israel. All that kind of stuff. We went for a long way. But we know that according to Jewish tradition, the holy mountain is not Mount Sinai. Indeed, according to Judaism, we don't even know where Mount Sinai is. Is something wrong? Oh, extras. I feel like there's a lot of movement here. Okay. So we don't even know where Mount Sinai is. I said that last week. The different scholars point to different places, and the traditional Mount Sinai was Jebel Musa, which the Arabs called Moses' mountain, and so, okay, that must be Mount Sinai, but we don't know. But what do we know? We do know the real holy mountain, which is Zion. Har Zion. But even today, because we're Jews, we have to screw that up, right? So this mountain next to it, outside of the walls of the old city, where by tradition David's tomb is, is called Har Zion, Mount Zion. But that's not Mount Zion. What is the real Mount Zion? The Temple Mount. All right, so the Temple Mount is the place. That's where we connect to God. Why the Temple Mount? And there are several answers that are usually given. What's the most famous answer? The one all of you should know. The sacrifice of Isaac, which we usually call in Hebrew, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding up of Isaac, right? That story from the book of Genesis, which you heard just recently, right, on Rosh Hashanah, and you're going to hear again in a couple weeks as we proceed through Genesis, that supposedly takes place on Mount Moriah, and Mount Moriah, is the Temple Mount. And that's why the temple was built there. If you read the last chapter of 2 Samuel, you will get a different reason. I am pretty certain no one here has recently read the last chapter of 2 Samuel. I would have included myself in that until someone pointed it out to me last summer, and we studied it and I read it. And there, the temple is built on this same mountain because of a story that has to do with King David. And that would take half an hour for me to at least to go through, and so it's another story for another time. But the Bible gives us at least two reasons why that happens. This is a third reason, which I said is in the form of a midrash, in the form of a story, which I like better than either of the other two. In ancient Israel, two farming brothers jointly owned a field. As it turned out, one of the brothers was a bachelor, and he lived at one end of the field. The other brother was a married man with many children who lived at the other end. One year, after the harvest, the brother who was a bachelor began to worry that since they divided the harvest equally, his married brother would not have enough to feed his family. He began to think that he was just one person and didn't need as much as his brother who had a family. Simultaneously, the married brother began to worry also that since they divided the harvest equally, his brother, who was alone, would not have enough saved for his old age. He began to think that he was blessed with a family to help and care for him, so he didn't need as much as his brother, who would have to provide for himself in his old age. What happened was at night, each brother took some of his half of the produce from the harvest and added it to the other brother's half. Each morning they would wake up and unexpectedly see that each still had half the harvest. That went on for many nights. Eventually, one night, the two brothers bumped into each other in the dark. Now they understood what had been happening and embraced, weeping in each other's arms. Tradition tells us that it was on this very spot that God decided the temple eventually would be built. Now, that's a whole different kind of thing than the near sacrifice of Yitzchak, right? Approaching God, not sacrificing. Korban. In modern Hebrew, korban means victim. I always love this. It means victim or offering. But that was all about giving of something in order to get close to God and God's holiness. In this case, is God in the picture until the last sentence? What is this about? What is this really about, this story? Love? What kind of love? This is not about romantic love. We might say brotherly love, right? So they're each willing to put the other's needs ahead of their own, which I think is being defined here as the ultimate holiness. Right? If their willingness to put the other's needs in front of their own motivates God to say, well, if I got to live someplace on earth, that's the place I want to live. Where brothers put the other's need ahead of his own. However you define it. Right? They were both right, or they were both wrong. However you want to look at it, it doesn't matter. What mattered was they saw the other one's needs first. And if you do that, that's a kind of holiness. That's a kind of tzedakah. That's a kind of korban, an offering. That's the kind of thing that, at least in this story, God seems to really care about. As emphasized by that's where the temple is. That this field, Taka, turned out to be on Mount Moriah. And that's why it was chosen. Joel. Yeah, you're talking about the water story? Right. What is consistency, Joel? What is the definition of consistency? Okay, so what does everybody know what Joel is referring to? There's a famous halacha that says if you're in the desert, two of you, and you only have enough, and I have enough water that I will survive. But if I share it with my partner, neither of us will survive. What am I supposed to do? And the answer, halakhically, is you keep the water for yourself. His life is not more precious than yours. You're not more precious. Nobody's more precious than anybody else. You've got the water. Somebody needs to live here. Okay. It is different because that is a kind of practical halakhic question as opposed to an altruistic story. I don't know that in the question about who keeps the water that the discussion has anything to do with holiness. It has to do with the practical halakha about how do you proceed. This story is a story that is intended to get us to think about what makes a place holy. They're just different kinds of things. I don't think they are contradictory, but I don't think that they necessarily you have to go with one side or the other. You use them in different ways. Yeah. They're not the same, but what Joel is trying to point out is that the tradition is not consistently altruistic. I would argue, what a surprise, but I would argue that what it could have said is certainly the choice of, we'll each have half and die, but we'll be happy because we each shared, just strikes me as dumb, right? Everybody would see that as dumb. Why should both parties die? And then if I say, no, altruism requires me to give you the water. Well, okay, now you have the water. You're Jewish also. You're obligated by halacha. What would altruism require you to do? To give me back the water. And so we would be passing the water back and forth to each other as we both died. So you follow me? This is a practical kind of thing that says what matters here is that we preserve the life we can preserve. Now, the story is trying to make a different case. It doesn't say at the end that God pinned a medal on them or that their names became known throughout the land. What it says is God chose that spot to build the temple. And we've taken pains to show that the temple represents the spot that is holy, where we can approach God. So I believe the intent of the story is to teach us something about how we might behave from an altruistic point of view in terms of approaching holiness. If that's what the goal of religion is, which I, for one, believe that's what the goal of religion is. The goal of Judaism is to approach holiness, to approach God, to be in a closer relationship with God. That's it. That's the whole thing. Because just the ending is so surprising to me. If I didn't know what the ending was, and it was the first time I read it, that would be surprising, that the conclusion is God's going to build the temple there. There's all sorts of conclusions you could draw from this, about brotherly love and how we should behave and how God does this, that, or the other. But instead, God says, this is where I will tell them to build the temple. No, it has to do with their behavior towards each other, why God chose to make that place holy. It's entirely different than the Akedah story, where the binding of Isaac is at God's command, and so that's what makes the place holy. It's a whole different way, a whole different approach. I think it's useful if we know these different approaches, so that we have a sense for the subtlety and the sophistication of Jewish tradition, as opposed to just a kind of linear kind of thinking. Oh, I know this story, it leads to this story, it leads to this story, this is where we are. That's a very kind of linear kind of way of thinking, and that's not the way Rabbinic Judaism operates. Rabbinic Judaism sort of operates like in a haze here, where there's all these ideas and concepts, and they're all floating around, and you sort of swim in there, and when you need this, you go there, you go there. There's no hierarchy or linear approach. Okay, now this next story, which is very famous, meaning in rabbinic circles, everybody knows this story. But you may never have heard of it. That's okay, it's not a surprise. But in rabbinic circles, where everybody studies some Talmud, right? This is going to be one of the Talmudic stories. I think often the most important parts of the Talmud are the stories, not the halacha. Often the Talmud never even gets to the halacha. We're going to talk about this halacha for 4 or 5 pages, and then we're just going to move on to something else. And there's never any resolution. That's typical in the Talmud. But the stories are almost always evocative, and they're always trying to kind of point us somewhere. Okay, so let's take at least a few minutes to try to read this story. This is the famous story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. So there's this guy, Kamsa. It's sort of interesting because this word is the Aramaic version of a word kamatz, which is, some of you know, is a vowel sign in Hebrew. But a kamsan, what's a kamsan? Stingy, a miser. Okay, so a kamsan, it's grasping, it's getting a hold of something, you won't let go of something. The stories, such and such holds on to a nickel so loud that the buffalo faints. That kind of, that kind of thing. That's a kamsan. All right. So in this case, his name is Kamsa, and there's another guy whose name is Bar Kamsa. So what's Bar? Son of. And they're not related, but so you can see it's like Kamsa and Kamsason. Right? They're very similar names, easily confused. So it happened this way. That a certain man had a friend named Kamsa, and he had an enemy named Bar Kamsa. Keep that straight. Friend Kamsa, enemy Bar Kamsa. Okay. He once made a party, and he said to his servant, "Go and bring Kamsa." Of course, it's a party. He wants his friend. The man went and brought Bar Kamsa. When the man who gave the party found Bar Kamsa there, he said, "You are my enemy. What are you doing here? Get out." Embarrassing him in front of everybody. So what does Bar Kamsa say? "Look, I'm already here. Let me stay. I'll pay you for whatever I eat and drink. I know you don't like me. I don't want you to spend any money on me." And what does the man say? "Out." "No." "Then let me give you half the cost of the whole party." And what does the host say? "No." So what does Bar Kamsa say? "Let me pay for the whole party." And what does the host say? Not only does he say no, he takes him by the hand and he throws him out. can just imagine what a scene this was. Worthy of a soap opera. As the stomach turns, right, so to speak. Yeah. Said Bar Kamsa, since the rabbis were sitting there and did not stop him, this shows that they agree with him. Let that sink in for a minute. I will go, because now he is really PO'd, and inform against them to the government. Who is the government? Rome. Exactly right. So he went and he said to the emperor, the Jews are rebelling against you. Said the emperor, how can I know this is true? So Bar Kamsa says, send them an offering, a korban, which means what? An animal from you, the emperor, to be offered in the Jewish temple. And then what he did, he said, look, emperor, you see what they do with your offering, and then you will see what they really think about you. Right? So he sent them a fine calf. However, on the way, Bar Kamsa made a blemish on its upper lip, or some say the white of its eye. Now, why is that important? You can't sacrifice an animal to God that has a blemish. If you're going to make an offering to God, it has to be the best. Nothing. You can't say, oh, I'm going to live up to my obligation to do my offerings. You can have this cow that has a broken leg and this one, that's starving to death because it hurt himself. No, you have to give God the best. So Bar Kamsa is doing what? He is sabotaging the offering, so what will the people do? What will the Jews do? They'll reject it, and then what will the emperor think? Because as you see here, in a place where it counts as a blemish, but not for them. In other words, the emperor would have thought it was a perfectly good cow, and now the Jews are rejecting the cow, which means they're rejecting him, the emperor, and that's not a good idea because it's good to be the king. It's not a good idea to anger the king, in this case, the emperor. Okay. So the rabbis were inclined to offer it anyway in order not to offend the government. How many of you would have chosen that option? Do we have any brave people? So even the ones that say yes, they went. I have no doubt that's what I would have chosen. I would have looked at this and said, Emperor, little nick on the lip. God will understand. We're offering this cow. I have no doubt about it at all. Said Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkiras to them, people will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar. What is this guy saying? What is Zachariah saying? Word will get around about what? Correct. Word will get around. What else might he be worried about? You always have to jump to the end, don't you? He didn't want to offend God. And what about the halacha? He said, what about respect for the halacha? It's their own halacha. We wrote, these are the rules. And what you're saying is because it's convenient to ignore the rules, the halacha, we'll just ignore it. Where he says, no, you can't do that. It'll be bad press. It'll be disrespectful to God, and it'll be disrespectful to our own rules. Nice counter. He doesn't bring that up, though. Yeah. It seems obvious to us, right? Seems obvious to us, but it clearly was not obvious to them. How do I know? They then proposed, instead of saying, oh no, you're wrong. We're doing it the way we thought. We're offering the animal. Instead, what do they propose? Let's go kill Bar Kamsa. This is a great story, really. Let's go kill Bar Kamsa so that he shouldn't go and form against us again. Right? How's the emperor going to know what we did with this cow? Unless Bar Kamsa is around to go tell the emperor, so let's get rid of Bar Kamsa. We don't want to offend God. We don't want to get a bad reputation about halakha. We don't want to offend our own commitment to halakha. So the easiest thing to do is let's go kill the traitor. But, again, the same guy, Rabbi Zechariah, said to them, is one who makes a blemish on a consecrated animal put to death? In other words, where's the proportionality in this, to use a contemporary term, right? Somebody who puts a nick on a cow's lip, do we put such a person to death? And the answer, obviously, from a halakhic point of view, is no. Okay. So Rabbi Yochanan thereupon remarked, because of the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves are exiled from our land. I think that the last part they might have thought, but not the first part. But think about this for a second. From their point of view, let's look at this story. But break down this story for a second. Why is the temple destroyed? All right, so do we know the answer to this? What is the traditional answer for why the temple is destroyed? 2 words, sinat chinam, the second temple. The first temple has other reasons. The second temple, sinat chinam, which means baseless hatred, hatred without cause. So this story is an example of that leads to the destruction of the temple. Let's see, who's at fault first? The first guy at fault is the host, right? He's making such a big deal out of the fact that Bar Kamsa shows up instead of Kamsa that he insists on throwing Bar Kamsa out, even after Bar Kamsa offered to pay for the whole party, knowing that he was a disruption, that he wasn't really wanted, but he was there anyway. He didn't want to be embarrassed by publicly being thrown out. He didn't want to change the whole course of the party. He offers to pay for the whole thing, and the host, who's nameless, but the host throws him out on his ear, as we would say, publicly. So who's at fault? The host. Then what does Bar Kamsa do? For being publicly dishonored, he decides to go inform on the entirety of the Jewish people in the land of Israel by tattletaling to the emperor. Yeah, I haven't gotten to them yet. So we have Bar Kamsa, right, who is also guilty of, at least you might say, overreaction, of kind of a silly kind of desire for revenge. Doesn't this all strike you as really human? This is what goes on in families every day to right now. And what about the rabbis? Are the rabbis guilty? Because what should the rabbis have done? They should have intervened. And so if you don't intervene, that is the equivalent of agreeing with what's going on, which is what Bar Kamsa concludes. You notice the rabbis, this is their story, they wrote it, they're telling it, and they're indicting themselves. They also are guilty. Then you have a guy who's a stickler for the halacha. You can't offer up that animal. It's got a blemish. That's against our rules. Okay, let's get him out of the picture. No, you can't kill a guy for putting a blemish on a cow because that's against the rules too. All he cares about are following rules. And what happens when all you care about is following rules? So you put them all together, And you have a real cocktail of screw up here, right? Everybody has screwed up. And what is the end of that? That's sinat chinam. And so what's the end of it? Our house has been destroyed, the temple is burnt, and we are exiled from our land. Who's responsible? We are. We are. We are. Either through sins of commission or sins of omission, which this story doesn't really distinguish much between. But we can intellectually see that the host does something stupid, that Bar Kamsa does something stupid, that this guy, Zechariah, is that his name? Zechariah, he does something stupid, and the rabbis just acquiesce. They don't do anything stupid, but they don't do anything smart either. I think this is really one of the great stories because it tells us so much about the human condition. Yeah, Joe. Yeah, you can say that about the Catholic Church. You want to say more about that? I believe it's a serious, serious question about what are we doing that we shouldn't be doing, and what are we not doing that we should be doing. Okay, you want to say it again, Joel? So I don't want to put words in your mouth. I've learned. No, we have plenty of examples today. Certainly, we can talk about during the Nazi period, but we don't have to go that far back, really, of institutions who have principles that should cause them to behave differently than they do behave. Mostly, they'll acquiesce in what they know is wrong. And that can be because of fear, that can be because of not wanting to be involved, not wanting to take responsibility. If I'm implying that this is an easy kind of problem to solve, do what you're supposed to do and act when you're supposed to act, it doesn't turn out to be like that. It is quite a bit, if not nearly impossible, to know when you should intervene. This story is told in such a way that at any point, if the rabbis had intervened, they could have changed it. At any point, if any of the characters had just been a little bit more soft. I mean, think of how extreme it is for a host to throw out this guy publicly. And then for that guy to be so consumed with the desire for revenge that he goes to the pagan authorities. And then for this rabbi to be so committed to the letter of the halacha that he won't let the rabbis do anything when they're finally ready to do something to mitigate the problem. And what you end up with is destruction. Sure. Maybe. It seems to me, though, the way the story is constructed, it's pretty clear to everybody that the host is throwing Bar Kamsa out. And that pretty much anybody could have stood up and said, oh, come on. It's a party. You know what? And it then became very clear to the rabbis what Bar Kamsa had done, right? Because first, they want to offer the animal, which clearly is the best solution to this whole thing, right? Just offer the animal and the story ends. But they're persuaded by his zealotry, his vehemence, standing up for the halacha. And that's still true to this day. Often we are persuaded by the uncompromising, the absolute certainty of somebody who stands up and has a point of view, and we'll tend to acquiesce in that. And it seems as if that's what the rabbis did. They not only acquiesced the first time in the behavior of the host, they acquiesced the second time when they don't offer the animal. Then they acquiesce the third time when he makes the same kind of halakhic argument when they wanted to go kill Bar Kamsa. Sort of an extreme action, right? We can't kill the cow, we'll kill Bar Kamsa. No, this is not about Yochanan ben Zakkai. Where did you see that? Oh, no, there's many Yochanans, and I honestly don't know. Usually, if it's Yochanan ben Zakkai, it says Yochanan ben Zakkai, not just Yochanan. Well, that he was about a practical solution, if you will. But even in that story, does everybody know what Joel is talking about? It's the famous story of the guy who gets smuggled out of Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem by Rome. His name is Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he gets a faction to get him smuggled out because you weren't supposed to bury anyone within the town, within the walls of the city, so they smuggle him out in a coffin. And once he's out, he is able to go to the head of the army, who I think is Vespasian in the story, before Vespasian becomes emperor and Titus takes over, his son. And he gets Vespasian to give him permission to create a school in Yavne, thereby establishing the notion of yeshiva, of an academy, of rabbinic Judaism. It's a story that says, you see, the Romans destroyed us, but this one guy fixated on solving a problem and being clever was able to move us into a different way of being Jewish, which we are still observing to this day. And so Yochanan ben Zakkai is understood as that kind of hero. What's often not talked about is why he was needed in the first place. You know, the Romans didn't actually go and kill everybody. What was happening inside of Jerusalem is the Jews were killing each other. That's what was really going on. The different factions were killing each other. Were burning each other's food piles. And so that's why the siege. Look, how long were they at Masada? 3 years that they were sieged by the Romans because they had food and they were relatively united. The same thing, the story is that in Jerusalem they had much, much more food stockpiled. Years worth. So why were the Romans able to do this so easily? Because the Jews were fighting each other. And that's why you needed Yochanan ben Zakkai. But we often tell the heroic part of the story, but we don't like to tell the story about why we needed the hero. We needed the hero because of us, because of sinat chinam, faceless hatred. It's a sad thing. I said this at the Brotherhood Brunch, but I've become more and more convinced that the reason Jews have survived is because of anti-Semites. Because the one time we become united is when we're attacked. There's something about that, too, with American identity. There's definitely something to it with Israeli identity. But this is a story that gives us a vocabulary. So in rabbinic circles, if you want to talk about this problem, you simply bring up the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, and everybody knows what you're talking about. Anybody else who wants to add anything to this before we move on? Okay, so let's look at number 15. Now we're moving from the temple. Right? Temple's destroyed. We're moving from the temple. The rabbis have a problem. The problem is, we all see it from hindsight. We know that ultimately rabbinic Judaism is what triumphs and becomes Judaism. But at the time, I think there must have been plenty of competitors, and it must have been anything but clear in the first few centuries of the Common Era whether Judaism would survive at all, and if it was going to survive, what it would look like. Right? Okay. So, what do the rabbis want to create? I don't think that this was a conscious decision where they sat down in a meeting, and decided when the doors are going to be locked and when they're going to be unlocked and who's going to be there. It wasn't that kind of decision. It wasn't like somebody said, what are we going to do next? It was like, obviously we have to have a place for people to gather. Right? And so that place of gathering, which in Hebrew is Beit Knesset, is also going to be a Beit Tfilah, a house of prayer, because that's what we're going to do when we gather. And it's going to be a Beit Midrash, a place of study, because that's what we're going to do when we gather. Right? Okay, so we now know that the synagogue, if you will, even if it's not exactly clear how all the history unfolds, but the synagogue ultimately replaces the temple. Instead of the temple, there's the synagogue. Instead of the sacrifices, there's prayer. And then there's the act of study and the act of tzedakah and other good deeds that becomes the mainstay of Jewish life. But how did that get established? So look what it says here. Ravin bar Rabbi Ada said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, what is the proof that the Holy One is found in a house of prayer? The verse, God stands in the congregation of God. That's from Psalms. And what is the proof that when 10 people pray together, the presence is with them? The verse, God stands in the congregation of God. In other words, congregation is defined as 10 needed for a minyan. So what are they doing here? Why would they say that in the Babylonian Talmud, in the book Brachot, page 6, back page? Why would they say that? What are they trying to do here? We're going to need the next page in a second. Why is it important to say God is in every place where there's a minyan? Okay. Did everybody hear what Karen said? Because it's important to create community. And so the rabbis understand implicitly here that creating a community is what is necessary for the next phase to survive. I would argue that's still the issue today. They said a community, a minimum community is defined as, for them, 10 men. We would say 10 adults. Right? But that's the minimum of community, and they need to ram home the importance of that community. So how do they do that? Just as God was in the temple, and that's why we went to the temple to get close to God. The temple is gone. Now we go to the minyan, where God is going to be, to get close to God. Which says you have an obligation to the minyan. No, everybody's nodding their head. Do we still feel that? It's an interesting problem, isn't it? So let's take it to the extreme. If you really believe it, that we must have a minyan, and that's where we meet God, then you live in a Jewish neighborhood. Right? So that you can have a minyan. It's harder every time we move and spread out. It gets harder to have a minyan. I mean, we just might as well be. I don't think any of us are ready to move back into the old Jewish neighborhoods. I'm not suggesting that. But we might as well be honest about it. When we grew up, I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood. Anybody else grow up in a Jewish neighborhood? You know what I'm talking about, right? Where what made it Jewish was there was a concentration of Jews. That's where the synagogues were. That's where the kosher butcher was. That's, when you could walk to your bar mitzvah tutor to be tutored for your bar mitzvah lessons. You remember all this kind of stuff, right? If there was a kosher restaurant, that's where it was. And so minyan, in the broadest sense of the word, was embodied simply in our proximity. Now, did they actually think all the time, oh, by living in this neighborhood and going to this store and doing this, I'm actually getting close to God? My guess is they didn't think that. Because as soon as I'll put it this way, as soon as it was easy for Jews to move out of those neighborhoods, we did. Okay. But I would like to suggest that we lost something when we did. And so now what we try to do through our synagogues, and this is going to sound funny. I used to say this, I just realized now since COVID it's going to sound different. We now create virtual neighborhoods. What I meant by that was the physical synagogue. Meaning, wherever we live, we see this as our neighborhood. And so we come from Hinder and Yan, to all be here. And when we are here, we feel that sense of neighborhood. But I would ask again, do we? Is that still true? Yes. Why? Why? No. Yes. First of all, that's what it says here. It's okay. But why? Because it was necessary. There was the expulsion. Jews were expelled. And so it was necessary. This is a kind of practical thing to say the minyan, not just 10, but the notion of minyan, is going to replace the holy place. Like God is going to be where there's a minyan. This is why it's better to pray in a minyan than by yourself. Certainly you can pray by yourself. It fulfills all the obligations. But it's better in a minyan because you know God is there. No, you don't need one. You don't need one. You sound very halakhic here. Think about this a little bit in terms of in an expansive way, not in a narrow way. What is our sense of obligation to the minyan, meaning to the community? Do we still have a sense of obligation to the community? Do we still remember what the community feels like? So, for a long time, we knew what community felt like, if no other time, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That's the only explanation I really can have that makes sense to me for why Dafka Jews choose to show up then. Let's show up on Yom Kippur where we all stink and we aren't eating anything and we're all... Why not Hanukkah? Why not everybody show up at Purim? Why not something... But we all used to show up on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I believe one of the major reasons we all showed up on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur was because we all showed up on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That's when we really felt the community. We understood still what it meant to be a Jewish community. One second, Karen. And then sort of Rosh Hashanah fell out of that, right? And it became just Yom Kippur. That's the day everybody shows up. And then it was just Kol Nidre. And now I'm not sure at all. So and I'm not the right person to talk to about this because of my technophobic kinds of tendencies, but I think that Zoom has not helped us any. Karen. Oh, this is long before that. I wish I had something really smart to say. Does anybody have an opinion on this? What changed? I think American life changed. And assimilation, but in the sense that we lived ever more far apart with more and more commitments to other kinds of things that once you take out of it, I'm not sure if what I'm about to say is right. I'm not even sure exactly how to believe it. But when you remove the religious element, when you remove the notion that the community is important because that's where God is and we coalesce around holiness, the whole thing starts to fray because the only thing that's keeping us together is that we're together. And as that becomes less important, because everything is sort of, in a kind of centripetal way, is spreading further and further apart, and we have more and more commitments and lots of different places, and travel has become... When I was a kid, the notion of traveling on the high holidays was anathema. I'm arguing for the importance of community. And that with... yes. But what I mean by that is what I see in the passage. That Jewish life is about approaching holiness. That everything we do should be encouraging that experience. That's what halacha is for. That's what the symbols are for. That, look, is reading from the Torah scroll, are the words really important? Yeah. More important, in my opinion, is carrying the thing around the sanctuary. And letting everybody touch it. Remember when we started doing that here? All right, so, and why is that more important? Because it's like saying, God is in our midst. We're here. This is what we're about. You want to know what it means to be part of Jewish community? This is it. Right. So for me, the symbolism, I actually wrote a children's story about this. In my synagogue in Modi'in, there's a cat that lives in the synagogue. And it's a female cat. But the cat's name is Shimshon, which is Samson. But it's a female cat. And the cat has the run of the place. The cat shows up at services, sometimes sits next to me, sometimes is sitting on the bima more than once or twice, has tried to get into the ark during services. And so I said to Simone once, this would make a great children's story, a cat on the bima, and being my wife, who she is, as you all know, she said, okay, go write it. And so I did. And one of the things that I say, why does the synagogue let this cat roam around? And my answer is, how does the cat make you feel when you see it doing it? When you see it sitting next to you, when you see it rubbing up against everybody and being friendly, when you see that even the cat gets to be in the synagogue, everybody can be in the synagogue, how does that make you feel? And I argue that's what the Torah scroll does. Why do we take the Torah scroll out? Because it's important about how it makes you feel. And it makes you feel part of the Jewish community. It makes you feel that you're in God's presence. So I think that the answer is trying, as difficult as it is, to recapture that sense of community. Personally, if you can't tell, I think that words have the least amount of impact. I think symbols have a lot of impact, and I think music has a lot of impact. So that's why, at least during my time here, we moved more and more towards singing everything. Yes. Yes. You can. And in certain communities that works. My view is generally not in Reform communities. Because as soon as you argue just for ritual, the switch goes off. If I were to argue at Temple Israel, there might be a sense of community that is built through the traditions of kashrut, be standing in the dark. I know that, right? But music still has appeal. Symbols still have appeal. And I know I'm reading way too much in this, but I see it all in number 15. God stands in the congregation of God. You want to know who we are? We're the congregation of God. That's who we're trying to be close to. All right, so let's look at the next one. Everybody has page 6? I got it. Thank you. So this is also from Brachot, at the bottom of page 5 first. This may be our last one. Rabbi Hamnuna said, how many important rulings may be derived from verses about Hannah's prayer? Do we know who Hannah is? She was a Haftorah again at the high holidays. You just heard her. She's childless. It's the theme about women who are childless and then how they end up being mothers, right? So what happens? How many things can be derived from the way she prayed? She prays. Now Hannah, she spoke with her heart. Hence, who says that tefillah must direct his full heart in prayer? Right? She was directed. She had kavanah. So if you're going to pray, we use her as the model, and you should pray with kavanah, which means with self-direction, intentionality, concentration. I don't care. Well, any of those words you can use. The word itself means to direct, kavanah, but this is what it means. You have to pour yourself into it. When she prayed, it tells us in Samuel that only her lips moved. Hence, he who says the tefillah is to do it clearly with his lips, but her voice could not be heard. Hence, it is forbidden to raise one's voice in the tefillah. So how are you supposed to pray the tefillah? You know, Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak. How are you supposed to pray that? Doesn't say either of those two things here. We are talking about Hannah. In other words, you don't pray it silently. Your mouth has to move, but you don't shout it. Quietly, because this is about concentration. And the last thing, and Eli thought that she was drunk. He was a priest. Remember, he thinks she's drunk, and he tells her to put away her wine. You remember that? So, therefore, if you're drunk, it's forbidden to say the tefillah. I think this is an important passage because who's the model of how to pray? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, Hannah. Hannah is the model of how to pray with intentionality. I just think that it's a great passage since we often are searching to find passages where women's voices make a difference in the tradition, and it seems to me this is one of them. 17. This is from Tractate Rosh Hashanah. And it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. Do you remember this story? This is when they're being attacked. And God tells Moses to raise his hand. We have this sort of, I came close to saying, silly statue out there, but I know that somebody will take offense at that. You all know that there's a statue out there, right? Which used to be in the lobby, I am told, of the old building. What's the statue of? It's Moses with Aaron on one side and her on the other side, struggling to keep his hands up. When I first got here, I was a little circumspect because I was new, and I was wondering to myself, why do they have a statue of a gnome out in the courtyard? Isn't that a little idolatrous? But I didn't say anything, and eventually somebody told me what it was supposed to be. All right, anyway, and it's still out there. Anyway, why has he got his hands up? What does God tell him? As long as Moses is holding his arms up, Israel will prevail, and so Aaron and her, they prop him up so that they will win. So what is the theological question? Is that what makes the difference? Did Moses have magic in his hands? Did Moses' hands actually wage war? Did they actually win the victories? And the answer that the rabbis give, of course not. What the text signifies is that so long as Israel turned their thoughts upward and submitted their thoughts to their Father in heaven, they prevailed, but otherwise they fell. In other words, who's really responsible? God. Moses, did he have any special power? No. But symbolically, he could get the people to direct their prayers to God. And by directing their prayers to God, then they prevail. In other words, there's no magic in the prayers. This is a bugaboo for me. If you don't know this about me, I'll tell you again. I personally have a problem. I say this every year. I personally have something of a problem with petitionary prayer. Petitionary prayer strikes me as an attempt to control God. If only I say the right words in the right posture, and if I'm obsequious enough, then God's going to do what I want to do, and my team is going to win instead of the football team on the other side that is doing the same thing. It just strikes me as an absurd notion, almost blasphemous, that if we just say the words right, we can ask God for anything, and God agrees. Sort of like, sort of like we control the mechanism. God is a kind of puppet. I just have a great deal of difficulty with it. So when I come across a passage like this that says, no, that's not what was happening. What was happening is the people with great kavanah were all turned to God through Moses' example and symbol, and then God responds by helping them. That's a whole different thing for me. And then, just in case we miss it, but it was, then the same question is asked about the serpent. Do you remember the serpent? The copper serpent? It's not really in Odysseus. It's because there's, I think in Odysseus there are two snakes in the medical symbol, and this one is only one on a staff. But it comes from the Torah that by looking at this staff you could be cured. I think it was scorpion bites or something like that that's happening in the wilderness when the people are plagued. And so they said, did the serpent actually keep people alive? And what's the text say? That so long as Israel turned their thoughts upward and submitted their hearts to their Father in heaven, they were healed. Otherwise, they rotted away. In other words, there's no magic in that serpent. There is no magic. There's no magic bullet. There is no way to bend God's will to ours. And I love this passage because here it is. They take two examples right from the Torah that would seem to say that human behavior controls God's behavior. And they said, no, these are symbols. What they represent is what's important. What they caused us to feel, how they caused us to think and behave and feel, that's what matters. Yes, Joel. Rarely. Okay, does everybody understand his question? I'm tempted to just say, we'll take this up next week, and by then you'll all have forgotten about it. No, keva is the fixed part of Jewish prayer, right? So the prayer service begins with the Baruch Hu. And following the Baruch Hu in an evening service, you have Ma'ariv Aravim. And then you have Ahavat Olam, and then Ahavat Olam, and then you have the Shema and its blessings, and then you have the Tefillah, and then you have Aleinu and Kaddish, right? In other words, that's the order, and that is called the Keva, or the fixed. And it's very, very important if you agree with anything I said earlier, because it helps keep Jewish community. Whether you're a Reformed Conservative or Orthodox Jew, whether you are in Dayton or Jerusalem or Kiev, if you are davening the service, it's going to have that keva, if you know how to see it. The service may not be so obvious, but I promise you, it has that same keva. It's what binds Jews across geography and across time. So if you want to think of it this way and this way, it binds Jews together. So the keva is very important. What's the problem with the keva? Is it, and this is what Joel, I think, was alluding to, it simply can become rote, which is sadly the way most, in my view, most Orthodox or traditional Jews daven. My father, Alav Shalom, used to call it yum-yumming, which is, you turn the page and yum. That's what they might as well have been saying, is what he, and I think he was absolutely right. So kavanah is that you are supposed to infuse these words with intentionality and meaning, which you do on your own, based on who you are and your experience and what you're thinking and what you believe. And then they come together to create a community where you're still an individual. Right? Or another way to put it, a bunch of individuals become a community through the keva, but they're still expressing themselves through the words. In my case, the problem's not the keva. If you know the keva well enough, it fades into the background. You don't even have to think about it, right? Which is what should happen. In other words, you just know, we're starting with the Baruch Hu now, we're going to get to the Shema. My problem is, frankly, all of these theological kinds of concerns and these other things that I've been talking about. It's hard for me to say the Shemona Esrei, which is filled with petitionary prayer, when I don't believe in petitionary prayer. It's not there on Shabbos. That's exactly right. But it is there most of the time. And even on Shabbos, we say there's no petitionary prayer because we don't do business with God, but we have a prayer for peace. We have a prayer for healing. There's plenty of it there. And so that's what I meant. So for me, it's finding occasionally I am able to get out of my own way. If you understand what I'm going for. And everything comes together right. You remember too, most of the time in my career until the last 8 years, I was standing up there, which meant I could see every single thing every one of you did. Every time. And if you don't think that's distracting, no, I'm serious. In other words, if you're trying to concentrate, and I'm responsible, whoever's up there, Karen, Tina, we're responsible for trying to make this atmosphere where it will all work, which takes a great deal of effort, planning, and execution. And then there's a lot of distractions going on. On Simchat Torah, one of the kids puked in the aisle. I mean, only because we have good people who chose to clean it up. I mean, did you wonder why we went off into the social hall too early before the Hakafot? It was because there was puke in the aisle. Well, I mean, Linda was the good person I'm talking about. but it's hard to maintain kavanah when this is happening. I'm just trying to be honest. In a class setting, we can be honest. And so part of it just had to do that I was not part of the congregation. So now for me, when I'm sitting out here, now it's the opposite problem because I can't stop myself from criticizing what's going on because, of course, I know how to do it. No, look, I get that. I didn't say this was easy, which is why I think the keva is so important. So if I'm ever going to have that experience of keva with kavanah, let's say it happens once every few years, I have to keep doing it all the time. Because it's never going to happen if I just show. This is what happened. People show up on Yom Kippur, and they expect this slam dunk experience. It doesn't work that way. I mean, it's like showing up for the Olympics and thinking you're going to win the 100-meter dash. I mean, if you haven't trained for it. All of this requires a kind of habit. Yeah. which Elise Frischman would be thrilled to hear you say that. I know the person who was the editor of this, and that is exactly what her thinking was. Frankly, I don't think it works, but that was exactly her thinking. Yes. We're really over the time limit, so we're coming. Yeah. You were not jam it. Is that what you're talking about? Okay, so if you don't have to go all the way to Chicago to on-jam it, just go to Omega on President's Day. Seriously, the reason it works there is what we were just describing. A kind of community that is built out of symbols and singing, and of course they believe it. There's that small matter that they believe it, which is at the center of that community that draws them in and holds them. Okay, so next week, next Tuesday night, we'll pick it up from here. Once again, if you want me to hold the papers for you, because we have a couple more on this page, just give me the last page. Yeah. Thank you all for coming. It gave me an opportunity to think about something else other than what I've been consumed with for the last 10 days. So thank you.